Hi there, and welcome to the Institute for Natural Medicine's podcast, The ND Will See You Now. In this podcast, we talk to naturopathic doctors all across North America about their whole person approach to health, what patients can expect, and why their work is so very vital to patient health. I'm your host, Anna-Liza, and today I'm just delighted to welcome Dr. Sonia Malani to the podcast. Dr. Malani is a naturopathic physician, researcher, yoga instructor, and meditation teacher with a strong focus in naturopathic oncology. After obtaining her doctorate in naturopathic medicine at Bastyr University, she completed a 2-year accredited integrative oncology residency at the Ames Institute. And Ames, by the way, stands for Advanced Integrative Medical Science. And while there, she helped build the IV therapy, that's intravenous therapy, clinic, and developed several evidence-based IV formulas for pain, hydration, energy, and even more. She's implemented 2 clinical trials investigating the effectiveness of integrative medicine in both oncology and psychiatric settings. And she's also a contributing author to the 5th edition of the book, Principles and Practice of Palliative Care and Supportive Oncology. And this is known as a vital reference text used by both conventional and integrative providers alike. Among other research projects, Dr. Malani is a co-investigator of the Ames Cancer Outcome Study, and that measures overall survival rates in cancer patients who are receiving integrative oncology care. And finally, Dr. Malani is also a new member of the Oncology Association of Naturopathic Physicians, which we all know as ONC-ANP. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Malani. So wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here today.
Well, let's start from the beginning. You yourself, from a young age, you just had this sense, you had this feeling, you had this calling that naturopathic oncology, by which I mean cancer care, is the direction that you wanted to go. Now, I understand that a family member of yours did play a key role in your choice in this career path. And I'll tell you something, Dr. Malani, you're not the first naturopathic doctor I've spoken to who has had some type of early life experience with somebody with cancer and ended up having that inspire, their career path as a naturopathic doctor. And I don't think you're the last naturopathic doctor that I'll speak to in this situation either. So can you tell us a little bit about this, Dr. Malani? Not only your own story, but how common do you think this is when either cancer patients or maybe even the patient's family members end up choosing a career in integrative or naturopathic oncology? Why might this be the case?
Yeah. Oh, it's such a good question. So I actually never really planned to be a doctor. And what happened was cancer just kept coming up in my life. So my mom was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer when I was 6 years old. And my father was diagnosed with stage 4 gastric cancer when I was 19 years old. Both parents diagnosed very advanced cancers. And when my dad was diagnosed, I was in the middle of college. I was picking a major. I was, trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And in that moment, when he was diagnosed and we were going to all of these different oncologists and going to all these different consults and hospitals and, trying to figure out what steps to take for his treatment, I just felt like this was a field that I needed to be in. But I knew that I didn't exactly want to be in the standard oncology world, chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, and that was it. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know what else there was. And I wanted to know how to make those treatments work better and how the patient could come out of treatment feeling more alive than when they went in. And so through that kind of passion and intention, I think, Bastyr University and naturopathic oncology kind of found me. So, you're exactly right. This is not a unique situation that I experienced, but I do feel like for those people who find a career or find a path through a diagnosis like this, it feels much more like a calling than it does a profession. I just remember when I was 19 and I just learned about Bastyr University and I was trying to Google it and figure out where this school is and where do I go and all of that. It just felt like the world was conspiring for me to go there. Like classes all fell into place. I was able to, go shadow NDs. I was able to fly out to Seattle and visit the school, and it all just, nothing about it was hard. It just felt like that was a path I had to be on. And so it was very clear that that's where I needed to be. And I'm very grateful to be here.
Well, I guess conspiring is one way to put it, or supporting. It
Mm-hmm.
sounds like the universe was really just supporting this career path of yours.
Mm-hmm.
And thanks for sharing that. As you mentioned, in your case, it wasn't just one family member, it was two
Mm-hmm.
family members.
Yeah.
And, it wasn't perhaps a distant cousin or a distant aunt. This was your parents. So
Right.
I can absolutely see how strong that is. And what do you think that when you think about your role now, working in naturopathic and integrative oncology, how do you feel like those experiences have really impacted how it
Yeah.
is that you are communicating with patients, that you're empathizing with patients?
Yeah. I've said this to a few of my patients, but I really, every day when I wake up and, prep for my patients and start practicing, I really strive to be the physician that I wish both my parents had had. Someone that was able to speak both languages, understand all of the conventional standards of care, understand everything else that there is, in the world, in the field of naturopathic oncology, and someone that's able to bridge the gap between those two. And so, part of my residency training and postgraduate training was making sure that I was rotating in hospitals and, shadowing medical oncologists and radiation oncologists and surgical oncologists and spending months in the OR watching reconstructive surgeries and, really making sure that I understood every single step of the cancer journey from the conventional and the naturopathic standpoint, because that's where I felt was the most stressful piece of being, a caregiver to my parents, or being, on the other side of the doctor's visits, or, not being in the doctor's seat, was just trying to ask questions and having someone say, well, I really don't know anything about that. You should find someone else to talk to. It was really hard to follow, your primary oncologist's advice, but then have a totally different provider say, well, this is what you should do diet wise, and this is what you should do lifestyle wise. And when you try to run those recommendations by each doctor, they're like, oh, I don't know. That's not my area of expertise. And so what I hope to be for my patients is that bridge where they can come and ask, questions about everything from chemo, surgery, radiation, diet, lifestyle, supplements, herbs, all of it, IV therapies, and for me to give the most evidence-based answers.
So really, Dr. Malani, you're pointing to a very strong role that naturopathic oncologists, integrative oncologists have to play with patient education, right?
Yes.
And as you mentioned, I dare say that experience is not unique. The one that you said you experienced when you were on the other side of things, trying to advocate for your parents, where you're trying to understand all the information that's being provided to you and sort through it. And the answers that you so badly, badly desire are not always available to you from all of
Mm-hmm.
these practitioners. And, speaking of these educational dealings, I wanted to ask you about how you do that nowadays in your
Yeah.
practice, because that is quite a focus. So, you yourself, you were born in New York, you live in Kentucky, but you actually educate patients virtually all across the United States.
Yeah.
And this is via your teleeducation practice.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a very interesting constellation of things. One, because Kentucky is what we call a pre-licensed state, meaning
Yes.
that naturopathic medicine is not licensed there. So you're in this really interesting position. You're living in Kentucky. You don't actually see patients in Kentucky, but you live there. So you have a sense of what that is like. I wonder what you would say to patients who do live in pre-licensed states, such as
Yeah.
Kentucky.
Yeah.
If these patients are living in these states and they do want to avail themselves of integrative oncology care, of naturopathic oncology care, what advice do you have for such individuals?
So I went to Bastyr in Seattle. I did my residency in Seattle, and I practiced in Seattle after residency. But recently relocated to this part of the country and have found that I was so used to a market in Seattle where naturopathic oncologists were, like yoga studios and coffee shops on every block. It was a very saturated market. And this part of the country, unfortunately, does not have many practitioners who are well versed in this type of medicine. There's only actually, I think, around 130 naturopathic oncologists in this country. So we can't realistically serve every community. And so as sort of a catalyst for the way that I wanted to practice, and with COVID kind of opening up teleeducation, telemedicine, telehealth opportunities, I built sort of a teleeducation consultation service or teleeducation practice where patients can access me, and I can provide maybe questions or recommendations, not necessarily medical advice. But what I do with my patients now, or what I do with my education clients, is really dialogue about their decisions, right? So talk about, we can still do some dietary conversation, we can still do some supplementary education, we can still do some chemotherapy education, we can do surgical education, we can do so many, we can really educate so that the patients can then go back to their oncologist or then go back to their primary care provider and ask really informed questions. And I think a good question is just as beneficial as good medical advice, because if you're asking the right questions, you're ultimately going to be able to, elicit the right and informed decisions for your body. So a huge part of my, practice has always been education. I think if we could get some of the naturopathic and just, general health into high schools and middle schools and elementary schools, that would be amazing, because people should have a right to know about their body.
That's a really interesting point. When I think about high school education, and I think about, for many people, that may be the last time that they would have taken a biology class or a chemistry class, maybe some basic anatomy. For many of us, that was certainly a long time ago. And as an adult, if that's the sort of level of health literacy, health education that you have, and then you find yourself in perhaps, having a cancer diagnosis, then all of a sudden you're diving into this world with all of the technical language, right? That in and of itself can be really difficult to understand. Getting the diagnosis in itself is really overwhelming. You've mentioned a couple of examples of the type of patient education that you're doing. Can you expand on that a little bit when you think about, let's say, the most common questions that you receive, or even the questions that you find patients are most relieved, or gratified to hear the answer? What would some of those things be, Dr. Malani?
Yeah, so I think the first question, I think the most important is, for a lot of patients, they think naturopathic oncologists have a silver bullet natural cure for cancer. And while I, wish that there was maybe a world of cancer treatments that you uncover when you specialize in this, what we really do is combine the best of conventional medicine with the best of natural medicine. And so the first, I think, the biggest question that I usually get is, can we do something completely alternative, or can I turn down this treatment, or those are the types of questions I get a lot. And what I spend a lot of time doing is educating how those treatments are actually going to be really beneficial for the patients. And so, basic teaching about what chemotherapy does, or what the surgery can do, or what a surgical resection can do, or what radiation treatment does. I think for a lot of people, the oncology visits are just very, they usually have to be somewhat quick, and there may not be a whole lot of time to ask questions. And the other thing is that it's a very stressful experience to go into an oncology visit, be told that you might just be diagnosed, and then try to come up with the right question. So, these visits, with a naturopathic oncologist, give you the opportunity to kind of step off the cancer conveyor belt and zoom out and say, okay, can you explain what this diagnosis is? Can you explain what these treatment options are? And so a lot of what we do is just treatment education. And I think that allows the patient to understand why they're doing what they're doing, and therefore have a greater compliance. Other questions that I get that are very top, it's definitely diet. How can what can I do for my diet? And there's so much education we can do there. I also find that for a lot of my patients, when they have this, kind of cancer label or cancer diagnosis, friends and family will come out of the woodworks and say, you have to try this treatment. You have to try this remedy. And you look at this article that I found online and try this. And so what I also tell my patients is, when you are getting those, articles sent from your cousin or your uncle or whoever it is, forward them to me. Let me do the research. Let me figure out what, whether this treatment has merit or whether this clinical trial has merit. And then we'll talk about it in our next visit. Because a patient should not have to focus on, reading medical literature and researching and doing this. this. They just need to focus on getting well. And so I hope to be that advocate for my patient to, take in all the resources and research and do that work for them. That's what we're really trying to do, is support the patient as much as we can.
Well, that in and of itself sounds like a beautiful service for you to be able to say to patients, so your, second cousin twice removed sent you this article that they are convinced that this is going to be the thing, your silver bullet. I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing you can provide to people, because frankly, even for, those of us, I include myself, that are really used to looking at medical research, this is hard stuff to wade through.
Yes.
Right? I mean, not only the language, but simply the way that oftentimes these medical studies are written. For the average person, it can really be challenging, not only to figure out if it's valid, like you said, but really to understand what it is, what the study is actually saying. Now, this is something that you're actually particularly well qualified, might I say, to speak to patients about, not only because, as you mentioned, naturopathic doctors do have that strong role in patient education, but in addition to that, like, you have a lot of research experience. And I want to ask you about one of these, because it's a really interesting study. You're working right now with the Ames Institute that I mentioned on the cancer outcome study. And this is really exploring these integrative oncology approaches and how they're working for patients. And I had the distinct pleasure of speaking to Dr. Leanna Standish, naturopathic Dr. Leanna Standish, who I happen to know you actually studied under, I should say, when you were doing that 2-year residency. When you first, got your naturopathic degree, and you were there at the Ames Institute. So this is a really beautiful thing that you're now back there, when you're doing this study. And not too long ago, I spoke to Dr. Standish. So listeners, you're going to see this podcast come out pretty soon, if it hasn't already by the time you see this. And what Dr. Standish said was, ultimately, the question is, do these integrative approaches work? Right? I think a lot of things can get complicated around the issue, but that really is the basic question. So what do you think, Dr. Malani? What are you seeing so far from the cancer outcome study in terms of answering that question? Like, what's working, what's not? What are you discovering so far?
Right. So if you haven't yet listened to Dr. Standish's podcast, the Ames Cancer Outcome Study is the technical jargon is it's a prospective outcome study. But what that really means is that any patient that comes to the clinic, Ames Institute, which is located in Seattle, is asked to enroll. Anyone that has a cancer diagnosis is asked to enroll in a outcome study where we track what treatments we are recommending, whether that's a supplement, a green tea extract at 500 milligrams, twice a day, or whatever we're recommending. We're tracking those recommendations and then tracking the survival outcomes of our patients. And what we're hoping to see in the next few years, because this is going to take probably 4 or 5 more years to figure out results, is are our recommendations working? And so what is interesting about that is, it's really hard to do a lot of this kind of more botanical medicine research, right? Every patient is different. Everyone has a different diagnosis. It's hard to find a large, number of patients all with the same diagnosis who are willing to enroll in maybe a green tea extract trial. And so instead of doing each different supplement or each different diet recommendation or each different lifestyle recommendation and doing a single study for each of those, what we're doing is we're trying to capture how all of those recommendations affect our patients in the long term. And ultimately, if we can show that our overall survival of our patients is longer, with a better quality of life than standard of care, then we know what we're doing is working. Because otherwise, what I think a lot of patients might resonate with is that there's a lot of noise in this wellness world. There's a lot of noise in the field of medicine in general. And it can be really confusing to know, well, should I take this supplement, or should I try this diet, or should I, completely change my lifestyle? And how do I know it's working? And as physicians, I feel like it's our responsibility to be researching, the recommendations that we're making. And that's why I'm really grateful to be part of this study is, in a few years, when we're able to analyze and look at all of data, we can say, okay, our, cohort of breast cancer patients who all got this supplement recommendation or who all did this IV therapy lived this much longer than patients who just did conventional standard of care. And then we can really show that adding both medicines and using the best of both worlds really does make a beneficial outcome or difference for the patients.
Well, I can't wait to see what the study reveals. I know you said you have a few more years ahead of you. I mean, which is quite right. Sometimes we do see in these studies that they're very short-term studies. Right. And this is something that when we look at the long-term studies, right, when we look at what we call the chronic, impacts and effects of what these interventions are, right, that you're testing out. And it's beautiful that you mentioned, you're quite right. I think with this botanical research and supplement research and so forth, it is very difficult, right, to get that critical mass of people that you need to make the study valid. With these specific things, and you're there at the Institute. This is what you folks are doing anyway. So it just makes sense.
Yeah.
Just makes sense.
And the OnC-AMP and Dr. Standish and there's some physicians in Canada have been doing a lot of these outcome studies already. And so we're hoping in these next few years that we can start, getting this data and really, hopefully building some sort of standards of care for the naturopathic oncology world too, so that, every patient around the country, if they're diagnosed with something, based on this research and based on our studies, can get these, specific treatments. So I think that's the end goal.
Well, absolutely. And, the other thing, not to give away too much about Dr. Standish's podcast, but we did talk a little bit about the cusio study that's being done. And I'll leave listeners to, dig into that podcast, when needed. But this is a study that's happening between our two countries, actually, between naturopathic researchers in Canada and also American naturopathic researchers in the States. So there's no lack, in other words, right? There's no lack of integrative naturopathic oncology research going on that is evidence-based and really will provide not only the profession, but patients, right? With the answer to that, as Dr. Standish put it, that all-important question, does it work?
Right. Yeah.
That's what it all comes down to. Does it work? Well, I think that's what this interview is going to come down to. Wish we had more time, but we've covered quite a lot today. Dr. Malani, you've given us a really nice sense. And thanks for being very authentic and vulnerable in sharing your own story about your parents and how their, that whole cancer diagnoses with them, different cancers, different stages coming across at different periods of time for you as a young person, and how that really impacted you. We've also talked a little bit about what naturopathic oncology care may look like in pre-licensed states, such as Kentucky, and also a little bit about how you're really using that strong component of naturopathic medicine, doctor as teacher, to really help patients understand not only what the naturopathic interventions are, but as you mentioned, quite often you're really explaining what the conventional treatments are, right? Yeah. And what those mean. So listeners, if you're wondering where you can find a transcript of this interview, links to learn more about Dr. Malani's work, you're going to find that in the podcast notes. And all that being said, Dr. Malani, what final words do you have to leave us with today?
Well, thank you for this opportunity again. And I would say for anyone that's listening, really, if you can, link up with a naturopathic doctor, link up with a naturopathic oncologist. We are here to be allies. We're here to support you through your journey. It can be incredibly overwhelming and scary and just overwhelming at times. And so we want to help support and make sure that your overall survival and your outcome is as beautiful as we can make it. So yes, I really love this field and I really love what we do.
Well, I think your patients would probably say the same thing if they were here right now. Thanks so much again, Dr. Malani. This is just the perfect place to end our conversation today. Really appreciate you joining us. Much gratitude to you. Listeners, thanks for joining us as well. And we'll see you next time.